one of the most unusual parts of this has been this ransom note, and I know that you've seen it several times, but would you go over it with us and tell us what you know and what you've been told about it?
Well, first of all, this is what is going to help us convict the killer. But please don't just investigate us, because if you do, we're never going to find the killer.
There is lots of evidence. There is a lot of evidence.
The Boulder police did a wonderful job of collecting evidence. Thank goodness.
Did you know the District Attorney, Alex Hunter, considered the handwritten ransom note the single most important piece of evidence in the Ramsey case? Did you know that?
I and my prosecution task force believe we do not have sufficient evidence.
But what was the ransom note except a massive piece of evidence? Not one page, not two, but three. Even Lou Smith had to admit that the writing pad and possibly the ransom note was damaging evidence.
You believe Patsy Ramsey killed her daughter. What is the strongest evidence that supports that?
There's a lot of evidence, but the strongest being the pen, the pad, the ransom note, and the handwriting.
Let's go over the ransom note. What do you know? What have people told you about phrasing or anything else in the ransom note?
Well, there's obviously a couple of references, I think, to something that people think came from a couple of movies, which would lend one to think that it might be maybe a younger person who watches a lot of movies.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
On November 29th, a month before JonBenet's death, the movie Dirty Harry aired on TBS in Boulder. In the movie, a kidnapper tells Clint Eastwood, "If you talk to anyone, I don't care if it's a Pekingese pissing against a lamppost, the girl dies." JonBenet's ransom note threatened, "If we catch you talking to a stray dog, she dies." In Dirty Harry, the kidnapper says, "It sounds like you had a good rest." That also appears in the ransom note. That's from Perfect Murder, Perfect Town by Lawrence Schiller. In Patsy Ramsey's interrogation with Steve Thomas on the last day of April 1997, Steve Thomas mentioned to Patsy the note was written from a pad inside the home. Patsy, "It was?" Steve Thomas, "Uh-huh." Patsy, "Oh, I didn't know that." She didn't? In Steve Thomas's book JonBenet, Inside the Ramsey Murder Investigation, on page 25, Steve Thomas writes, "Detective Arndt asked Ramsey, White, and Fernie for their opinions on the ransom note. White and Fernie commented that it seemed to reveal a familiarity with John Ramsey. The use of such words as hence and attaché indicated the writer was educated. John Ramsey had little to say about it and was unusually quiet. None had any idea what SBTC meant. In the sunroom," this is really important, "Patsy Ramsey examined a second-generation photocopy of the ransom note, a smeary version that showed little more than the dark printed words. Rather than commenting on the words and content, she told one of her friends that the note was written on the same kind of paper she had in her kitchen. Police would wonder how she could tell, since they saw no similarities. But do you see the contradiction here? Patsy saying, the ransom note, this was on the day after Christmas, December 26th, saying during the kidnapping phase that the note is written on the same kind of paper she had in her kitchen. Yet when Steve Thomas asked her, whether she knew that the note was written from a pad inside the home, she seemed surprised. She said, "I didn't know that." Now, bear in mind, the interview that she gave was in April 1997 to the police. This reference in Steve Thomas's book came out in April 2000, around about 3 years later. And have a look at this from Perfect Murder, Perfect Town. Patsy Ramsey, inconsistent on details. Patsy Ramsey gave conflicting reports to police about whether she found the ransom note before or after she discovered that her daughter was missing. That's according to the story in Vanity Fair magazine. Now we go to March 2000, Larry King's interview with John and Patsy Ramsey. John Ramsey. A uniformed police officer, arrived relatively quickly, and I said, I handed him the note. I said, my daughter's been taken. Hold on. I handed him the note. The ransom note itself isn't just a crucial piece of evidence in the Ramsey case, but through this piece of evidence, John and Patsy's references to it, their behavior surrounding it, what friends of the Ramseys said about what was in it, and what they knew about the Ramseys, all of this allows us a sort of conduit to get to know not just the Ramseys, but the fabric of this entire case so much better. It's easy to reduce the ransom note to basically to two questions. Whose handwriting is it? And does it prove there was a kidnapping or a cover-up? But those two questions end up being far too reductionist and simplistic. As I said, the narrative surrounding the ransom note basically asks us to test these stories for consistency, and two obvious initial inconsistencies arose almost immediately. One was that Patsy said she checked on JonBenet first, then found the note. The other was that she found the note, then checked on JonBenet. If we accept her version of events, shouting an alarm to John, this is after finding the note, and checking only JonBenet's room and Burke's room, then that in itself beggars belief that JonBenet would be missing and they would only check 2 rooms in that house. But also the fact, with this apparent shouting going on, why did Burke stay in bed, asleep as far as his parents were concerned? Even after the cops came into his room, the lights were still off, and Burke still seemed to be asleep. When one after another of the Ramseys' friends arrived, and cops, and remember, most entered through the front door, well, guess what? The front door is directly below Burke's bedroom and bedroom windows. Are you telling me he never got up, never checked to see what was going on, never wondered what was going on? There's also the simple anatomy of Patsy's description of 3 pages covering one of the rungs of the stairs. Not like this, by the way, like this. In order to be able to read the whole note with pages side by side, that would mean an entire stair would be covered. So how could you step down and over it, let alone jump over it and head upward back upstairs? And look at this from Lawrence Schiller. The pages showed no indication that they had been stepped on. This seemed plausible until the police recreated the scenario that Patsy described. The detectives found it was impossible. Now, there are also other aphorisms the Ramseys used that appeared in the ransom note besides and hence. Anyone know what they were? Well, before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you're finding this analysis worthwhile, please do hit the thanks button. If you've never ever hit the thanks button, consider it an early Christmas present, and let's continue. So any other aphorisms that appeared in the ransom note that the Ramseys used quite often? Well, have a look at this. John Ramsey. There was a couple of phrases that came out later. You must grow a brain, and other fat cats here, or something like that. Michael Caine. You're not the only fat cat around. John Ramsey. Well, grow a brain, fat cats. We'd heard them before. John Ramsey. My friends were around me, consoling me and trying to give me advice, and to be part of that group, it's the Atlanta Fat Cats. And then from Lawrence Schiller, Karen Howard, an employee of Access Graphics, said that she was struck by the words, "You are not the only fat cat around." Howard remembered that Patsy's father, Don Paul, used the word cats all the time. For example, those cats down in marketing. There have also been a few questions about destructive evidence testing, of the ransom note. While one of the tests for evidence on the ransom note was for fingerprints, and this process is pretty destructive. It involves baking the note in an oven and also dousing the note in chemicals, both of which aren't particularly suitable for the longevity of the paper it's written on. Something else, another narrative that's basically had a life of its own thanks to the ransom note, was the evolution of Patsy's handwriting afterward. This is really important and very, very interesting. And according to Good Morning America, an interview with Steve Thomas, I was trying to find the original, I wasn't actually able to find it, but we do have this transcript. Elizabeth Vargas says, Thomas says investigators interviewed 590 people, investigated and cleared more than 100 suspects, and collected 1,058 pieces of evidence. And there's some people who say the police didn't do a good job, and this is not really an evidence case. There's no evidence. There's insufficient evidence. Anyway, the trail always led back to one place, that epic ransom note. The note asked for $118,000 and claimed to be from a small foreign faction. Thomas says they checked handwriting samples from 73 potential suspects. So how can you say they only investigated the Ramseys? 73 potential suspects. But only one person could not be ruled out as the author. And that one person, according to Thomas, was Patsy Ramsey. And in Patsy's pre-homicide writings, he said in the same interview, Patsy consistently used what we call the lowercase manuscript A. In the ransom note, almost exclusively, the lowercase manuscript A was used, I think 98% of the time, in the ransom note. Vargas. So you're saying that in the ransom note, this style of the letter A was used, and that in all of Patsy's writing samples prior to the murder, she used an A like this most of the time when writing. Thomas, right. Vargas. But after the murder, she changed. Patsy changed her writing style to use this kind of an A so that her writing samples after the murder wouldn't match the ransom note. Vargas. That analysis is from a leading expert used by the FBI. It's not just her writing style that came up in this interview, but Patsy's writing format. Folks who write for a living tend to have particular quirks that are easy to recognize. I would say mine is the M dash. I'm also quite fond of memes. Something I stopped doing was using British spelling and expletives. So you can have an evolution in terms of your writing and the format of it. There are also a bunch of expressions I repeatedly use, such as, does that make sense? And so what were Patsy's? What were basically the memes that she regularly leaned on? And so in the same interview, Steve Thomas highlighted a couple of Patsy's idiosyncratic writing quirks, some you may have heard of and some you probably haven't. Vargas. Thomas says there are still more similarities between Patsy Ramsey's personal letters and the ransom note. Thomas. The indentation, for example, on the sign-off. It's up to you now, John! Exclamation point. Indented, victory, exclamation. Indented, SBTC. We were able to find in prior writings of Patsy, for example, how she would almost consistently sign off with the exclamation point and then a double indented closure to the point you could almost overlay the ransom note onto some of Patsy's previous writings. And besides this use of the exclamation mark at the end, he says, I found the indentation remarkable. Vargas. And in Patsy Ramsey's previous writings, there was something more. Thomas notes her penchant for acronyms like BVFMFA, that's Barbara V. Fernie, Master of Fine Arts, which she called her friend on her Christmas card. She signed the card PPRBSJ, Patsy Paul Ramsey, Bachelor of Science in Journalism. And then Vargas provides this disclaimer. Patsy Ramsey denies she wrote the ransom note, which was signed with the mysterious initials SBTC. Vargas also raised an important question regarding fingerprints. Was the paper the sort of paper that one could easily leave fingerprints on? Just FYI, when people provide their fingerprints non-digitally, guess what? It's done with ink on paper. Why? Because paper is such a good substrate for absorbing all of these oils and tiny patterns. Vargas. Is it possible that the parents could have handled the note and not left fingerprints, or that the paper for some reason didn't retain that kind of print? Thomas. Certainly, but then I think the argument can be made when the sergeant touched the same pad, he left a fingerprint on it. When the CBI examiner, and that's Chetubowski, touched the same pad, he left a fingerprint on it. Patsy had left previous fingerprints on that pad as well, 5 that were identified. So that remains one of the mysteries in this case as well. How come there's no identifiable fingerprints on this thing, on this ransom note, if one or both parents handled and grasped it that morning? And we know that John said in the one interview, I handed it to the police. Now in the next analysis, we're going to deal with the one handwriting analyst for the prosecution who the DA, Alex Hunter, did allow to present his findings to the Boulder grand jury Chetubowski. And he will form the latest in our series on peripheral figures. And we'll deal with Chetubowski's position and his assessment of the ransom note and what he said to the grand jury in the next episode. Right, so until then, I'm not going to take it further than that. Thank you for listening. Have a great weekend, and I'll see you guys next time.